How would you define sex? Because our discussion tonight is going to be around healthy sexual boundaries, sexual trauma, and sexual abuse, which is frightening if you actually realize how often it happens out there and how often it happens to people. And in my practice, usually the Wednesday wisdom sessions, at the end of every month, I have a theme that goes through my practice. And this one has been a lot, it's been surfacing a lot that there is a lot of sexual abuse and sexual misunderstanding. And it's funny because people come to see me for different reasons. And as we start to delve a little deeper, it usually reverts back to sexual abuse and things that happened to them when they were younger. And that's actually scary because you cannot believe how many people go through this. So I decided to make this Wednesday Wisdoms all about chatting about healthy sexual boundaries, sexual trauma, more or less what causes it and how you can handle it on a basic level, because everybody's different. Okay. And everybody's got different ideas surrounding sex and what sex is and what sex is not. Okay. So if you have to think for yourself, what constitutes sex? If you have to define sex and somebody has to ask you what sex is all about, I'm sure all of you are going to give me a different answer, or most of you are going to give me different answers. And that is because there's a wide range of sexual practices on this planet. And the people that taught you about sex and how to engage sexually, usually they didn't know better than the people before them. And who teaches you about this stuff? Most of the guys I ask, most of the girls I ask, most of the people I work with is who taught you about sexual actions and how to have sex? Is it school, teachers, which the school education system surrounding sexual practices is not very in-depth and they're very uncomfortable speaking about it. I've spoken at schools to some boys. Some of the schools hire me to go and speak to the boys about sexual education because they just have boundaries that they cross. And the answers that those kids come up with is actually fascinating. And some of them are hilarious. Some of them are downright scary because when we delve deeper into it and I ask them questions as to who they were taught, who taught them about this, who taught them about the information that they're getting. It's usually family members or brothers or sisters. It's not often the parents, which is funny because the parents don't want to have these conversations with their kids surrounding sexual interactions. You can imagine that that's quite a rough discussion to have. Okay, so healthy sexual boundaries. If we expand our information around the globe and we try and find out what sexual practices and protocols are happening all around this planet, it becomes very, very interesting and it becomes very, very strange. I won't say weird because weird is a judgment call. We cannot judge what is weird and what is not, especially what's happening with the 8 billion people on this planet. But sexual practices, especially in the tribal arenas, certain tribes have very, very strange sexual customs. For instance, in Cambodia, the elders would build love huts for the teenage girls, and these teenage girls can go and lie with as many men as they want to in these love huts. And as they lie with these men in these love huts, they can sleep with them until they find one that is actually linked to them, that they actually feel excited about. And then they will stay with that boy for the rest of their lives. And that's quite strange. Imagine in the Western civilization, we build sexual love huts for our teenage girls, and they can sleep with as many people as they want until they find the right one. So that's pretty strange. Then in New Guinea, there are tribes that do very, very strange things. The tribes in one of the New Guinea tribes, especially in Papua New Guinea, they would have the boys drink the semen of the strongest warriors. And not only the boys, the girls as well, to give them energy. And that is just part of their culture. And we would think they are completely crazy, but for them, it's a natural way of being. The other tribe, their boys become sexually active 12 to 13 years of age, and they allow the girls to become sexually active at the age of 6, which is a bit rough to think about. But for them, it's a way of life. And all these weird and wonderful things happen, and weird and scary things happen around sexual protocols on this planet. Then when I sit with clients and I ask them, okay, but what do you want? what is sex for you? How do you define sex? What are the rules, the regulations, the protocols in place for you to have a healthy sexual relationship? And when you expand the mind, then healthy sexual boundaries is just a point of view. But there are certain repercussions to what you do and what you don't do. Okay. And these sexual practices around the globe, it really becomes ridiculous. It's sometimes I wonder if I'm not reading fantasy novels because of the logic that goes around it. In Thailand, they've got slap therapists that slap the breasts of females and massage it because, according to them, it firms the breasts and it makes them bigger. And I'm like, wow, okay. I don't think science backs that very much, but that is part of the culture. That is what they used to. That is the belief that these females associate with the therapist power, and that's what they do. So, how do we define healthy boundaries? It's quite difficult, especially cross-culturally, because different cultures have different sexual boundaries. And what would be acceptable for one culture would be taboo for another culture. What would be totally crazy for one culture would be totally normal for another culture. There's another tribe that the men in the tribe, they actually just sleep with men during planting seasons because they think it'll make the ground more fertile and they can grow more crops. I'm like, okay, that's just homosexuality. And it's not for them. It's just like, no, they're not homosexuals. That's just natural. Men sleep with men during the planting season. And it's quite interesting to come and observe how these people just so casually says that this is what they've been doing all their lives. This is the culture and this is what they work with. So I'm like fascinated by this. So what happens if we expand the mind across the globe and learn about different sexual protocols? Then you realize, but wait a minute. Nobody can tell you what a healthy sexual protocol for you is, for you and your partner, for you and whoever you want to engage with sexual interactions with. But there are a few things that will help. The first one is consent. Okay, you have to have consent in a sexual relationship. Just imagine, most of the trauma that I've seen in my clients and that they've experienced was no consent. Either they were young and an older party abused them, molested them, raped them, whatever, there was no consent. Or, funny enough, even in the framework of marriage and a healthy relationship in the marriage environment, consent is discussed very little because it's just the woman's job. Okay? Well, in some cultures, especially in the Afrikaans cultures. A lot of my clients that I worked with, they're like, oh, but this is just expected of them. I'm like, wow, but just because it is expected of you doesn't mean you have to do it. Okay, that comes down to basic consent. Now, if there's consent and healthy consent between what constitutes a healthy sexual relationship for you and your partner, then the second thing that comes in is communication. You have to communicate with your partner. Now, this is very difficult because that means there has to be a degree of vulnerability between you and your partner and between the things that you discuss. And if that vulnerability, especially on the man's side, doesn't exist, they'll just make assumptions. And those assumptions are usually incorrect when it comes to female sexual relations and male sexual relations. The men are usually incorrect of what is right and what is good, because they don't want to communicate. They don't feel comfortable. They might feel shy. They might feel pressured to perform in a certain way. So communication is key. It is important, and it's crucially important that a man also understands how to communicate during sexual intercourse. And that's not what you see in the movies. The undertone of sexual interactions in movies most of the time is quite violent and quite quick. And I say violent, not as in bad violence, but it's rough and it's throwing its arm around. It's this moment of passion, and that's just not what it is in real life. Okay, so when guys see that, and when girls see that, and teenagers and young people see that, and in the soapies and in the series and all these things, they get an idea of what sexual interaction is. Now, as we've established across this planet, nobody can really say what healthy sexual boundaries are because it's just too vast, all the things that's happening on this planet. But if there's communication as to what you want, what you don't want, what you like and what you don't like, then that's fine. But in the middle of this communication comes in the third point of healthy sexual boundaries, and that is respect the limitations. So respect the limitations that you might have or your partner might have. right? Because if you're in the middle of a heated, passionate moment, something feels uncomfortable. How often would a girl say, no, stop, I can't do this? Or a guy say, no, I don't feel comfortable with this? That doesn't happen very often. They just push through. Now, if you have to push through and you have to compromise, that puts you in a very awkward situation, because then your inner voice, what you want, or sensitivities, you suppress all of those and you just do the deed. And it is fascinating how much this happens in sexual relationships. And usually not always, because there's no absolutes, there's not always. It comes from childhood and experiences that this person have had in childhood, whether that be trauma, whether that be abuse, whether that be rape, whatever the case was. There was a sexual experience when you were younger, and this experience hurt you. You knew it wasn't right, but it had to happen anyway. And then the mind dissociates, because the body, remember, your body's full of nerve endings and senses, and it's supposed to have these senses for you to make sense of the world and for you to experience the world. Now, if these senses are incorporated in sexual activity, it's actually nice, because that's what it was designed for. If sex was not pleasurable, I don't think any of us would have been born. Okay, because sex is pleasurable, so we want to procreate. And that energy that drives the procreation is usually what people fall back on. It's a very low vibrational energy just to have sex for procreation. And I think there's only a couple of species on this whole planet that uses sex for other reasons than procreation. Human beings are one. I can't remember which were the animals. I think dolphins, and I think there's a couple of other species that enjoy it. Okay, they don't just use it purely for procreation. So that enjoyment, when you are abused when you are younger, when something happens to you, your mind creates a different part, it dissociates, but your body's still experiencing the experience. Now you can imagine the communication gap that happens there. On some level, you know this is wrong, but your body's still having these experiences. Women might get aroused, men might get aroused. There's still senses happening, there's still physical implications of what's happening here, but your mind just cannot fathom it and just cannot deal with it. So it pops out, and then you shut off. But if you don't link that back to what happened in your trauma, if you don't deal with the trauma, if you don't overcome the trauma, if you're not honest with yourself about the trauma, then that sticks with you all through your sexual experiences in life. And something might feel off, something might feel wrong. So it is crucially important to be honest with yourself. If there was sexual abuse and sexual trauma, where does it lie? Does the body remember this? Yes. Okay. Because a lot of people can say, yes, I remember the feeling exactly. I remember what my body experienced. Okay. So does the body have memory? Yes, it does. Absolutely. But the problem comes in when the mind starts latching onto this body memory and just, I call it the snowball effect. So it just makes it worse and worse and worse. And then thoughts go, and you cannot stop those thoughts. The thoughts are there for a reason. They are there to give you feedback of what happened to you, so that you can actually make a conscious decision to start facing what happened to you and start facing what was going on with you, especially during sexual abuse. So it's a definitely, it destroys the mind. Now, energetically, because we've got an energy body, and that's weird because people think, oh, this energy stuff is just a bunch of nonsense. But it is not, because if you've got a body that's dead, deceased person, and a person that's alive, if you test energetic components within that body, this one will have no current and this one will have some current. Bioelectricity, it's called. So there's a definite energy running through the body. Now, on a sexual abuse level, what does that do to the energy? You can imagine that it creates havoc, creates a lot of havoc. Lots of different sexual partners, lots of different sexual experiences, even people who rebel against authority and go out and do whatever they want, they create imbalances in this energy body. Now, if I have to ask you, I'm sure a lot of you will get this answer right, because intuitively we know this. Male energy and female energy, especially sexual male energy and sexual female energy, is there a difference? Absolutely. I'm sure most of you will answer yes, because we know this to be true. We know this is a fact. The energy that the male portrays during sexual activity and the energy that a female portrays during sexual activity is different. And those two have to harmonize. So if you don't even know what your sexual energy is, if you don't even know what your sexual boundaries are, if you don't even know what healthy sexual boundaries are for you, what are you doing going to a sexual relationship and not even knowing what's happening? That's a bit rough. Okay. But it happens more often than not. More often than not, there's alcohol involved, there's stimulants involved, people can't remember, their drinks get spiked. There's horror stories all over this planet of what happens with that sexual energy. But that is not wrong. That is not your fault. Something that happens when you are younger, something that happens when you were a toddler, a teen, a preteen. Most people feel very, very guilty about the sexual act if they were abused and think it was their fault. And that's not unnatural. You cannot believe how many times I've taken people back and worked on the subconscious level, and they feel this tremendous amount of guilt for what happened. How can a little 6-year-old girl that's been raped by her uncle and her father, or stepfather in this case, feel guilt surrounding that and somehow think that it was her fault? That doesn't make logical sense when we're grown-ups, right? And it wouldn't make logical sense if you asked these questions yourself. It would obviously not be that girl's fault. How can it be? It is physically impossible to be that girl's fault. But yet, the subconscious mind latches onto that experience. Someone goes, okay, you were the weak one. You should have done something different. You should have avoided this situation. You should have done, all these shoots. It drives people crazy. Okay, so when it drives you crazy, what must you do? You must take a step back from the thought process. Okay, it helps to link the mind to a bigger picture, because when the mind starts making the problems bigger than reality, you've got a bit of a problem. Your mind starts to latch on to this reality, and it makes this incident that happened to you, or many incidents in a row, many years, it's different. Abuse is different. Some people once off, some people over the years, some people 20 years and counting. And then you step back and tell your mind, okay, but you've experienced all of this. The time frame doesn't matter. And then you take your mind, okay, what are the different sexual practices in the world? What did I learn from this? What did I not learn from this? What can I do here? What can't I do here? Just allow your mind to just take a step back from making the problem bigger than the reality. Okay, because it gets stuck in a loop, and that's not fun to have that mind stuck in a loop. Now, a lot of people say a healthy sexual relationship in the context of marriage, a safe marital environment, is awesome. But believe me, safe marital environment, that's debatable. Okay, because I've seen so many sexual encounters and heard so many stories and worked with so many clients surrounding that safe environment that's supposed to be a content marriage, the most atrocious things happen within the confines of that environment. And now, because these guys are married, they must do what the partner wants. And I'm like, wow, that's rough. Imagine a partner gets away with so many atrocious things just because now this is the way marriage works. So we have to take a step back to basic relationship health and what relationships mean to you and what you want in a relationship, what you don't want in a relationship, what can be, what can't be, what you can communicate, what you can't communicate. And nope, not a lot of people do that. So in the confines of marriage, it's amazing the stuff that happens there as well. And I can't remember when, but it was quite a long time ago. I read an article in a psychology paper that stated that actually so many things that would be classified as rape happens under the guise of marriage, because the man has the right to sleep with his wife. And I'm like, wow, that's a scary thought. I don't know how accurate it was, but from what I've experienced in my practice and what I've seen how people work and talk about it, that sounds a bit accurate, because the relationship within the confines of marriage is not all it's cracked up to be. Right? So you must be very, very careful with what your mind does, how your mind labels sexual health, and what sexual boundaries are good for you and what's not good for you. Because most of the time, the people that taught you or the experiences that taught you are not accurate. And incidentally, if you have an experience that you felt was not accurate, it didn't feel right, something was off here, then you go back and you learn from that experience. You would probably not repeat it, would you? Most people do, because they don't take back and they don't say, okay, but I'm allowed to learn from this experience. I'm allowed to say no in this environment. And even in the middle of the most passionate engagement, if something feels off, you're allowed to stop. You're allowed to say no. And usually, if the other partner is insecure or the other partner does not feel safe with his own sexuality, there will be conflict. But at least it is better to avoid conflict within yourself than just accept what's happening to you. And unfortunately, it's most of the time the females that takes the brunt of the sexual abuse. Granted, men as well. I've had some men in my practice that you will will not believe the stories. Okay, but most of the time it's the females that suffer with the sexual abuse. Why? Because who teach them they can stand up for themselves? Who teach them they can say no and that's what doesn't feel comfortable? And when you link sex to love, of course, we call it lovemaking, right? Making love. But here's the subconscious trick. If you link sex to love and you call it lovemaking, then all your acts of sex, if you feel rejected, then you are not lovable. Then this person doesn't think you're good enough. Then you are not worthy of love. You must be very careful of making the links in your mind of what constitutes love and what constitutes sex. Now, in a perfect world, if you can have an intimate relationship where the male and female energy, female energy, male energy, it doesn't matter because there's so many sexual practices on this planet. If there's consent, if there's open communication, if there's nurturing, then that can lead to a healthy sexual environment. And it sounds weird, nurturing, but if you think about it, if somebody loves you, will they force you to do things to your body and with your body that you do not want to do? It's an interesting question. But will they? I doubt it very much. I don't think they'll force you because that's not nurturing. If somebody loves and respects you and they say, okay, well, let's try this, let's experiment with this, and they see that it does not work for you, but it works for them, they won't force it down upon you. They'll say, okay, let's find an alternative, what will work for you as well. And it's amazing because the people that I've worked with and the stories that they come up with and the incidents many years ago when I started out, it was probably about, I don't know, probably about 20 years ago. Can it be already? Time flies. But I did case studies when I started doing my subconscious work and started seeing clients and started to see how the subconscious can assist with these problems. And this, one of my first, I had the weirdest case studies in the beginning, but one of my first case studies was a person I knew had a family member that struggled with self-confidence. And I thought, okay, now we can work on it. We can start on it. And I'm all brave. And I walked in and there was this man. He was in his mid 60s, if I remember correctly. So I don't know, he's probably in his 80s, late 80s today. I don't know if he's still alive today. But he was sitting there and we started our session. I went through my notes and stuff. And as we delved a little deeper into the subconscious mind, it came out that he and his wife in the mid 60s agreed to a threesome. And I'm like, okay, interesting for that age category because you won't think people will do that. But in his mind, a threesome was another person, male person, and his wife, not another female person. So he called the shots, and another male person convinced him that this is what happened. And this poor guy, when he saw another man kissed his wife, and when he saw what this other man was doing to his wife, it caused such huge trauma that it wasn't the self-confidence that was a problem. It was his whole self-image that took a knock after these years of marriage. So people do amazing things in the context of sexual energy, sexual relations, sexual experiences, but he was not prepared for what was going to happen. He didn't play it through in his mind. He didn't think of the repercussions. He didn't think what would be the good and the bad part of this. They just wanted to experiment. So experimentation is good, but experimentation without introspection is a nightmare. Okay, so if you want to experiment sexually, if you want to do certain sexual things with you and your partner, have an open communication about it. See what the end result is going to be. Imagine what that would look like. Imagine what that would end like. Imagine the conversations you would have afterwards. Imagine all the positives and negatives surrounding this environment. Then your mind can start to make sense of what healthy sexual boundaries would be. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, the final thing that happens is sex is a very small part of our whole biological process. And yet, I don't know, but more than 80%, a couple of years ago, it was 90%. I think it's gone down, I hope. but more than 80 to 90% of the internet is used for pornographic stuff. Now, if such a small part of our biology, okay, is so rife all the time and takes up so much space in our mental capacity, what do you think happens to the human race? What do you think happens to us as humans? I mean, the things that you don't discuss is sex, politics, and religion, right? But sex is the biggest one. I mean, it's crazy how many people want to find out about sex, different activities, so curious, pornographic stuff, non-pornographic stuff. It is insane. But it's only such a small part of your reality, such a small part of your biology. Okay, it shouldn't be the thing that drives you. It shouldn't be the thing that you pursue. It shouldn't be the thing that leads to love. It shouldn't be the thing that makes your decisions. But most of the time it does. And unfortunately, I know I'm a man, but most of the time the males are guilty of this. All right. So I hope this makes sense. For healthy sexual boundaries, there needs to be consent. First of all, that's the base of all your interactions. Make sure there's consent. If there's not consent, then there's going to be trauma. Okay. Once the consent is there, open communication is necessary. Once the open communication is established, it is important to respect limitations even while you're busy with what you're busy with. Okay. Then you can actually have a better relationship sexually. You can actually have a better, healthy relationship with your partners, with yourself. Okay. So thank you for joining me again, guys. I usually keep it about half an hour, and it will be great. If you guys have questions, you're welcome to ask. If you don't want to ask here, you're welcome to send me a message on WhatsApp because you're on the group. You've got my number there. And I'll answer the questions as best as I can, because most of the time people don't want to ask questions surrounding this because it's an uncomfortable topic. But I would urge you to take the discomfort out and just state the facts of what your experiences are, what you would expect, what healthy boundaries could be, and just have open communication surrounding your sexual interactions, your sexual energy, and what can work and what can't work. Then it will be a totally different ballgame. No pun intended. Ball game. Okay. So if there's no questions, I'll give a minute or two to check in the chat box if somebody asks a question. Rosa, it does make sense. Excellent, Rosa. Thank you. I hope it makes sense. I hope there's some things that set in that you can go play with and that you can go actually think about. All right. And yes, you're welcome. I'm too late. What age do you start educating your child about sex? Oh, okay. Educating children about sex. Let's do this quickly. When you educate your child about sex, it's usually when they start asking questions. Now, be very, very realistic about this. No matter how much you try and protect your child, no matter how much you try and keep your child away, somewhere along the line, today's school and societal structures, they're going to be exposed to it. And it is a scary thought what they get exposed to. I mean, the stuff that the kids I've worked with gets exposure to is, in my day, I was like, what? How the hell? Excuse the French, but it's amazing what they get exposed to. So if you start educating your child about sex, when they start asking questions, you answer the questions, you answer it just to their level. You ask them questions. For instance, if they want to know anything about sex, like I love to use this example because it was one of the funniest examples. I'll never forget it. I was working with a group of boys, and I asked if they've got any questions. And this one boy put up his hand, and they say, and I know he wants to make a statement because he looks at me and he looks all excited. I say, yes. He says, sir, did you know? I'm like, no. He says, did you know that when you have sex with a woman and you have a condom and that condom slips off, it is lost forever. It's gone. I was like, what the hell? And I asked him, okay, but wait, yes, so you think a woman's vagina is an abyss, that stuff just disappears up there? He says, yes. Big eyes like this. And I asked him, where did you learn this information? He said, no, his brother taught him. I'm like, oh, okay. So I didn't go further. I didn't correct him. I asked him where he got the information, and I restructured the information and tell him exactly what it was and what it wasn't. So when you're educating your children about sex, be honest, please. Okay, they're going to be exposed to so many things, but you need to be honest in their frame of reference. Don't give them more information than that they ask for. Don't go off on a tangent. Just be straightforward and just give them the facts and explain to them there are certain ways, and if they feel uncomfortable, they're welcome to ask other people, but you would like to know what their questions would be surrounding sex. I hope that makes sense, Dasha. So there's no age, okay? It is age, it's not age dependent. I mean, there are different 5-year-olds, different 6-year-olds, different 7-year-olds. They're not all the same. So developmentally, if you look at the different age groups and what they look like differently and their cognitive abilities. And to give you an example, I was also speaking at a remedial school to the children about sex, and two of the boys put up their hand. They didn't want to be there. They felt very uncomfortable. And I told the teacher, well, let them go. It's fine. They don't have to be there. You don't have to force them to listen to this if they don't want to. They will come out eventually and ask questions. Okay, so please don't go age specific, but hear what they talk. If they get exposed to something, discuss it with them. Be absolutely honest, be absolutely open, and yes, just be comfortable with your own sexuality first before you start educating your children. I hope that makes sense, Dasha. Max, never thought that even in marriage there should be boundaries, as we were raised with the thought that women should never say no. Yep. Not always easy to work through trauma as a 3-year-old that has been raped, especially in later years. Yes. Okay. So, Max, you know that there are certain techniques now that I can't do in a group session, but there are great subconscious techniques that can help you work through that trauma, especially if you've been raped as a 3-year-old, because your subconscious mind acts like a storeroom for all your events in your life, which is fascinating. And we can definitely work on that. And there's definitely ways and stuff, but you can actually contact me on WhatsApp privately and I can give you some better advice than in the group setting. And it is true because women are taught, no, you're not allowed to say no. It's your duty as a wife. I'm like, whoa, shoo, it's a bit rough. Your duty as a wife. What happens to you physically? That's like rape. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit harsh, but it's the same thing. Okay, so Max, I hope that answers your question. Tasha, how important is it to use the correct terminology? No, use the words that the children use. So, if you ask them, okay, but this question is surrounding sex, what would you say sex is? They'll come up with all different words. Then they must explain what those words mean to them. And you use the terminology that they use. Don't go off on the correct terminology, scientifically accurate. I mean, not even grown-ups want to know all of that. If you ask a grown-up anatomy about the sexual organs, very few of them are going to give it to you. Okay, so it's not that important to use the correct terminology. It's important to use their terminology, find out what their terminology means, what they are referring to when they refer to certain parts of the body, and the questions that they have surrounding them. And then you can tell them, after you've explained what the function of this is, what their terminology is, then you can tell them, but it's also called this and this and this and this. Don't be so strict and so accurate with the terminology. I mean, really, it's not necessary. Okay, I hope that makes sense, Tasha. Good. I hope that answered your question. All right. We went a bit over time, but that's natural. Okay. And yeah, this is a very interesting subject, and this is a very contentious subject because people don't want to discuss about it, but I think it's important. It's important to discuss and be comfortable with it. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining me. May you have a peaceful evening. May you understand healthy sexual boundaries. May you understand that you're on a planet that has sexual protocols that are totally strange. But if you ask the right questions, if you set the right boundaries, if you do some introspection, you can find healthy sexual boundaries for yourself and for your partner. And that might lead to a better intimate relationship. Okay. Thank you very much for joining me.